The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 16. Violet's Point of View. Violet couldn't see a thing with the blindfolds on, but she could feel where Damon was leading her. She remembered the steps and direction, so she knew he was taking her into his office. Violet could feel that they were passing by his desk, and they stopped for a moment before entering another room. Violet wondered if this was the room from the secret door behind his bookshelf, where that girl emerged before. Violet didn't have to wonder for too long. The next thing she knew, her blindfolds were off, and she could see everything in front of her. Violet didn't know what to make of what she saw. She was standing inside a large dark room with LED sconces hanging all around the walls. In front of her was a huge mirror, and in front of said mirror was a huge bed with black metal poles. Violet's eyes widened instantly. She took note of the wall of weapons on display on one side of the room. Then she took note of all the ropes and hooks hanging from the ceiling. There were chains and wooden beams and something that looked like a massage table and a cross in the shape of an X made of wood. And at another corner in the room, there was a low pillory and metal chains. Violet's mouth fell open in shock. She had never seen anything like this all her life. This room looked like a torture chamber from a psycho thriller movie. Is this where I'm gonna die? Violet shuddered at the thought in her head. What is this place? As if to answer the question in her mind, Damon let out a chuckle and said, "Welcome to my world, your world." She asked cautiously. Damon took a moment to look at the horrified expression on her face. He must have found it amusing, because he only smirked and said nothing else. He then led her to the wooden cross in the shape of an X and made her stood in front of it. Violet swallowed hard as Damon started pulling her wrist, and she was chained to the wooden post. "What are you gonna do to me?" she asked. Violet's back was flushed against the wood as Damon pulled the chains tightly on her. Her hands were raised up and her legs were spread wide, following the shape of the post. "Nothing," Damon said once he finished tying her up. "Yet." Violet tried pulling on her wrists and legs, but the metal chains didn't budge an inch. She could only watch in fear as Damon turned to the door and pressed on the intercom button. "Send my number 1 and 2, he said. "Yes, sir," the person on the other line answered. It didn't even take a minute later until the door creaked open. Violet turned her head and saw the blonde girl from before and a redhead walking in. They were wearing latex bra and underwear, fishnet stockings, and 6-inch heels. They had the body of supermodels, and they walked with confidence over to Damon. "Good evening, master." The blonde girl batted her eyes seductively as she stood in front of Damon. "How can we be of your service today?" The redhead followed. The two girls put their hands all over Damon's body, and the blonde girl looked super possessive. She forced the redhead away from his view, and the redhead circled to Damon's back instead. "I'm gonna need you two to give us a good show," Damon said as he glanced at Violet and at the bed. The redhead obeyed instantly and walked over to the bed. The blonde was about to follow suit, but she stopped her tracks. "You won't be joining us, master?" The blonde pouted. "Nah." Damon shook her head and walked over to Violet, leaving the blonde girl disappointed. "I want to see you give us everything you got," he said again. "Certainly, master." The blonde girl obeyed and sashayed her way to the bed, where the redhead was waiting. "What is he doing?" Violet watched as Damon was walking a circle around her. Meanwhile, the two girls had started kissing and running their hands all over each other's bodies on the bed. Violet tried her best not to look over there, so she kept her eyes on the floor instead. "You don't want to miss this." Damon stood behind her and pulled her chin up suddenly. Violet was forced to face those girls and see what they were doing. The two girls began undressing each other, except for their fishnet stocking and heels. The blonde pushed the redhead down on the bed, and she buried her face in between the redhead's legs. The redhead began very loudly as the blonde girl kissed and played with her female part. Violet wanted to look away again, but Damon kept his grip on her chin. His other hand had also snaked around her body and was now cupping her lady parts. His fingers flicked and rubbed against her sensually, mimicking what the blonde girl was doing to the redhead. Violet felt the blood in her body rising. Her heart began to race, and her skin was turning red. Her body began to squirm, and Violet had no control over it. As much as she wanted to break away, she couldn't. She pulled on the metal chain as hard as she could, but she ended up only hurting her wrists. "I told you, the more you fight, the worse it'll be," Damon murmured to her ear. He then let go of his grip and stepped away from her. Violet let out a breath of relief. She turned her gaze back to the floor, but she did see that the two ladies giving pleasure to each other. Before Violet could get too comfortable, however, Damon was back again, and he pressed a little white device to her lady part. He started rubbing the thing over the fabric of her nightgown. Then, with a click of a button, the small thing began vibrating, and it was sending jolts of electricity through her body. Violet's eyes jolted open, and she struggled to clench her thighs closed, but to no avail. "It's amazing what the human body can do, huh?" Damon chuckled tauntingly. Violet clenched her jaw and tried her best to suppress the feeling, but Damon only pressed the device harder against her skin. Her whole body began to shake, but moments before she could find her release, Damon pulled the device away, leaving Violet dejected and powerless. "Damon, please." Violet knew it was useless to beg for mercy, but she couldn't take it anymore. For the next 10 minutes, Damon continued this torture on her body, and it felt like an eternity. She was forced to watch the two girls having while Damon teased her relentlessly and denied her of a release. Violet tried her best to fight all the sensations taking over her body, but she had no control. She was hearing and feeling the pit building deep in her stomach. Damon kept one hand on her neck to make sure she was still watching, and his other hand continued working the device. "Please." Violet couldn't even speak. Her cries came out without a sound. With Damon's hand on her neck, Violet couldn't breathe. Her heart felt like it was about to explode, and her brain went into overdrive. The other girl screamed, and that was the last thing Violet remembered seeing before she blacked out. Damon's point of view. Damon knew Violet was no match for his games, but he never expected that she would faint in the middle of foreplay. He saw how her eyes rolled close, her body went limp, and her head hung low. Damon flinched a little, and he loosened his grip around her neck. He tried to bring her face back up, but they hung down again without any strength or support. "Shit." Damon cursed at himself as he checked the girl's pulse. He let out a sigh of relief when he found her pulse. He also checked her nose, and luckily, she was still breathing. Violet was okay, but the stress of the situation was probably too much for her that she passed out. Without waiting for another second, Damon unlocked the chains on her wrists, and Violet's limp body fell on top of him. He caught her and started unchaining her legs. Damon picked up Violet's little body in his arms and carried her out of the room, leaving his number 1 and number 2 in the middle of their show. Damon took quick steps as he walked out of his office and back to Violet's bedroom. He laid her down on the bed and checked on her pulse one more time, just to be sure. The pulse was weak, but it was there. "She's fine. The girl is fine." Damon shook his head and pulled his fingers from Violet's neck. He stared at her for a moment, and his cold eyes were filled with confusion, and there was even a glint of worry there. Damon pulled up the duvet to cover her body and figured she could use some rest. He thought about sitting in the room for a moment to make sure she was okay, but then he realized how dumb of an idea that was. The girl is fine, and she should learn her lesson. Damon took one last look at her before he turned for the door. He closed Violet's bedroom door shut before stepping back to the hallway. He had only taken 3 steps out when he heard a voice calling after him. "What did you do to her?" Damon whipped his head back to see a familiar girl staring right at him. Her wavy black hair was tied into a ponytail, and her eyes were filled with judgment. "Talia," Damon acknowledged her presence. "What are you doing out here?" "I asked you first. What did you do to Violet?" Talia retorted back. She sounded like a worried big sister. Nothing without her consent. Damon rolled his eyes in annoyance. She agreed to this. She's only 18. She doesn't know what she signed up for, Talia argued. That's not my problem, Damon shrugged. Talia glared at Damon. She didn't like his response, but she didn't know what else to say. It was impossible to argue with Damon. Clearly, he saw nothing wrong with what he was doing. Is she okay? Talia asked after a while of silence. She's fine. Talia crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes like she didn't believe him. But Damon was unfazed. Damon, you shouldn't be doing this to her, or to any other girl for that matter. Talia sighed and shook her head. She's just an innocent little girl. No one's innocent, Damon replied simply. Talia looked like she wants to protest, but Damon only ignored her and turned around. He walked a few steps away from her before Talia called out again. Damon, she said. He let out an annoyed sigh before turning his face back. What? Are you ever going to let her go? The poor girl misses her family. Damon let out a mocking scoff. And I care why? Come on, don't be like this, Talia said rather sternly and stepped closer to him. You not this person, Damon. You're better than this. No, he shook his head and cut her off. This is exactly who I am, Talia. Get used to it. I don't believe that. Talia stood her ground. I know who you are, Damon. I know what you're capable of. And this isn't you. Talia's gaze pierced deeply into Damon's eyes. He stared back at her for a moment, but then he looked away. Think whatever you want, but that Damon is dead, he muttered before turning around again. What would Isabella say if she could see you now? Damon stopped his tracks instinctively when he heard that name. His jaw clenched and his hands curled up into fists. He whipped his head back to Talia and shot daggers at her like he was going to kill her on the spot. Well, guess what? She can't, he hissed. And don't ever say her name to me again. Damon's tone dropped an octave lower and Talia gulped. She was trying to look strong and unfazed, but she was shaking on the inside. What are you going to do to this girl? She stammered. Why do you care? Because she's my friend. I care about her. She's not your friend. Damon shook his head firmly. Then he paused for a beat before adding, she is an interesting girl though. I'll give her that. Damon let out a smirk, and Talia furrowed her eyes. She didn't quite understand what that meant. How long are you keeping her here? I'll keep her for as long as I want. He shrugged and turned around again. And I plan on keeping her for a long time.